1885 arrived over Ashford's Hollow like glass, smooth and brittle, and wrong in ways nobody wanted named. Snow never came. Only a pale sky and a metallic smell like coins warmed in a palm, like fires that had burned somewhere far away. St. Florian's orphanage kept its duties, hymns before sunrise, porridge after, chores that scraped small hands, lessons in a room that once cured meat. The boys lined up in soft shoes with frayed heels, backs straight, eyes trained on a crucifix tilted slightly left as if listening for confession. They grew thinner as a season refused to freeze, and their words shortened. Even laughter came trimmed like bread with the crust cut away. They glanced often at the chapel's iron door, the one that hid the cellar. The keyhole showed darkness. The handle stayed cool whatever the stove did. Sister Merritt counted heads with kind patience, grateful for fewer coughs. Yet she noticed a new game the boys played when adults pretended not noticing. They called it statues. They stood in prayer posture, held their breath, and fought not to blink. Whoever moved first lost and learned to lose quietly. At night, the flue rasped with a not bird, not rat sound. Mornings revealed a sparkling grit on sills, neither ash nor salt, sharp when touched. No one spoke of it. The carpenter blamed settling floors, the blacksmith blamed strange drafts, the doctor blamed appetite in warm winters, and comfort returned. On Sundays, the chapel smelled of lemon oil and old books. Candles burned straight, disciplined, their flames steady as held breath nobody dared release. Jacob Fenn, smallest of the older boys, pressed his ear to the chapel floor when alone and heard breathing below, hollow and calm, like wind jarred. He told gentle stories to himself, angels practicing voices underneath, a sleeping bellows guarding weather, the earth's chest rising and falling without complaint. Because he needed them, he let those stories stand as truth, and the quiet agreed, and the floor stayed warm under his listening cheek. Coal ran thin by Epiphany, so Mrs. Lyle baked flat bread on hearthstones. Dark rings marked circles the boys traced with thumbs before swallowing. Idle habit hardened into a small private rite. Meals felt unfinished without it, and nobody asked why a ring on bread felt like permission. Handwriting tightened into careful rows. Pale smudges formed at the base of throats, thin gray collars that washing could not lift. Nails showed crescent scratches. At sunset, the sky went colorless, then tin dark. The porch bell tapped itself. Wood shrinks in dry air, said the sisters, and nods answered questions. Miners whispered the ridge air turned fine-grained, able to slip through cloth and hang inside lungs. Lamps flared, then steadied, as if inspected and approved. Men returned to work because work was the valley's language. Fear learned to move politely. Wonder learned to sit very still and keep its hands folded. Jacob practiced breathing, in sips, and studied stillness in a mirror. Hands folded, eyes half shut, face plain, a boy hoping to cause no waves. The calm felt like drifting over a deep well, smooth and easy. By late January, the statue's game had no smiles, only shivering edges of sight. If one boy swayed, another steadied him with 2 fingers and a quiet warning look. Victory became longer silence, longer stillness, longer private pride. The iron door stayed locked. Once Sister Merritt tried the handle, and every boy looked away together, as if eyes could keep a necessary promise shut. By Candlemas, the town spoke around the winter that wasn't, like walking around a missing step. Remarks ended shaped like questions, never finishing themselves. Footsteps paused outside the orphanage gate, measured and polite. No one hurried to answer. The sky held its breath while a soft voice prepared to enter. Brother Callum Reed arrived on a soft afternoon when the sky looked polished and harmless, carrying a school teacher's satchel and a folded letter of assignment that smelled faintly of lemon oil. He was small, tidy, and ordinary in a way that lowered shoulders. His clear eyes did not search for faults, and his smile lived at the corners like a bookmark, patient and gentle. The sisters felt something unclench, because work had stacked high and winter never came, and the boys needed steadier hands than tired ones could offer. The registry named him a brother of modest vows and useful talents, careful with books, careful with time, careful with children who accepted rules when rules sounded like mercy. He listened before speaking, and when he spoke, words touched down like snow that would not melt, even in quiet. He set an orderly schedule, morning prayers slower, chores by height, lessons cued by a bell struck once so the sound would not startle thin nerves. The boys leaned toward him the way seedlings lean toward warm windows. He never raised his voice, and he never let praise outrun truth. Discipline, he said in the tone used for blessings, is a path that spares you chaos. He made small changes no one wished to challenge. Pencils trimmed to equal lengths, hymnals in cloth covers, a basket outside the chapel for slips of paper listing the day's mistakes. He called the basket the relief, because confession is lighter when it fits in your palm. He moved into the small room beside the cellar stairs where drafts collected. Yet his lamp never wavered, as if the air there had learned better manners. At night he walked to the iron door with the steady patience of a clerk. The lock turned softly and only the careful noticed. Inside on a table he spread a pale square of cloth stitched with thin thread. He lined instruments upon it, an unmarked metronome, glass cylinders with fine lips, a brass hand mirror. He arranged, paused as if listening, and nodded to no one. The boys named him the Whisperer without unkindness. Near him thoughts seemed to sort themselves, and sometimes he answered questions not yet asked. One night Jacob Fenn woke to a quiet voice in his head counting his breaths, measuring rather than scolding, and slept again thinking of a counting angel. Callum took inventory of habits, who chewed collars, who stared at closed doors, who could stand still without shaking. He loved order like a gardener loves straight rows. By the third week, the orphanage moved like a clock that kept time in generous silence. He added an evening practice he called examination of stillness. 5 minutes kneeling, hands folded, breath softened until the chest barely rose, eyes lowered to avoid pride. He corrected shoulders with a brush of his sleeve, counting in his head, not to punish but to achieve a shape. Sister Merritt watched and felt both peace and a small, unreasonable fear, the kind that hides in kind places. She shelved the fear because duties did not shrink. Callum's ledger grew neat columns, attendance, chores, lessons, stillness. He marked an asterisk when a boy trembled too soon, a circle when a boy held posture to the end. The circles pleased him like tidy margins please a scribe. He began to bake morning bread, saying hands that teach must also feed. He dusted the loaves with a pinch from a jar. The bread tasted fine, and nobody questioned the habit of tapping the top twice before slicing. At vespers he let hymns run one note longer, training lungs to hold quiet rather than air. The boys liked a note that did not end when expected. He listened to the building as others listened to sermons, tilting his head toward pipes, gaps under doors, and the iron mouth of the cellar, smiling without teeth. The town, busy with mines and missing snow, received him as an answer to a question not yet formed. In this answer the boys stood straighter, candles burned smoother, and the locked door at the hall's end looked less like a warning and more like a promise waiting for the right key quietly always. The rule began without ceremony. One Monday morning after prayers, Brother Callum simply told the boys that words would be set aside for a time so their thoughts could become clearer. He spoke as though explaining the turn of a season, his voice even, almost tender, and not a single child protested. From that day forward, the orphanage's corridors felt wider, the air somehow denser, as though sound itself had been drained out. They were allowed to write, but only to confess. Short admissions of fault, no longer than 3 lines, slipped beneath the narrow gap of Callum's door before bed. These slips, he explained, would be read and prayed over, the burden taken from them by hands meant to guide. He never said aloud that the slips never returned. The first few nights the boys wrote neat, careful words. I stole another crust of bread. I did not say my prayers, nuts. I thought of running away. But as the days passed, the writing began to change. Letters crowded together, ink blotted, words lost their shape. Jacob, Fenn's once graceful script, now trembled like a leaf in the last wind of autumn. No one remarked upon the changes, but the boys noticed the same thing. When handwriting grew too erratic, the bed of that boy would be empty by morning. There was no alarm, no wailing farewells, only the sound of Sister Merritt quietly stripping the sheets and folding them away. Callum told the remaining children that the missing had graduated to heaven early, a phrase spoken in the same voice one might use to praise a perfect recitation of scripture. A candle sealed inside a tall glass jar was placed on the chapel's altar in their memory. The glass was never opened, even to replace the wick. In the silent days, the boys began to read each other's faces like books. Tiny movements, a twitch of a mouth, the shift of an eye, because no other language was allowed. They learned to carry their thoughts in their heads like a heavy bowl that must not spill. Even the clumsy learned grace under the discipline. Mealtimes became a slow ritual of scraping spoons, careful sips, and the faint shuffle of feet. Callum's presence was constant, not oppressive, yet inescapable. His eyes followed without accusing, his hands always folded, his steps without hurry. He seemed to know when a boy's mind wandered and would place a hand lightly on his shoulder, holding it there until the boy's breathing matched his own measured rhythm. The candles in the chapel multiplied, 3, then 6, each one standing sentinel in its glass prison, each with a small slip of paper tucked beneath the base. No one dared lift one to read what was written. The scent in the orphanage shifted subtly, away from soap and bread toward something drier, like books left too long in a sunlit window. The air grew warm even without the coal fire roaring, as if stillness itself gave off a heat that clung to the skin. Outside, the town continued with its strange winter of no snow. Men worked the mines without the interruption of storms. Women hung wash in January and watched it dry in the pale sun. But the miners began to complain of odd dreams, dreams of holding their breath for so long they woke gasping, only to find they had been breathing steadily the whole time. None of them knew they had walked past the orphanage that day, hearing nothing but the faintest hum, a vibration in the bones that was not wind. At night in the sleeping hall, Jacob stared at the ceiling and listened for the shuffle of boots. Sometimes he heard them pass, slow and deliberate, heading toward the chapel. Other times they stopped outside a bed. The air would thicken and he would squeeze his eyes shut, willing his breaths to be small and invisible. More than once he woke to find a new candle in the glass jar, its flame unnervingly still, as if it too obeyed the discipline of silence. The first time the sound was heard, it came from beneath the orphanage as the moon rose behind the black ridge, casting pale light across the frozen creek bed. The cold delivery man, trudging home after dropping a half-load in the cellar chute, stopped halfway across the yard. From the vent set low in the stone wall, a strange rhythm pulsed outward, soft inhalations followed by empty, whistling exhales. It was breathing, but not the kind that carried warmth or life. It was hollow, as if air were passing through something long emptied and perfectly dry. He leaned close enough to feel the faint tremor of it against his ear, but pulled back quickly when he realized it matched the beat of his own heart. Inside, Brother Callum had begun a new practice for the boys, calling it the prayer posture. After evening hymns, he would gather them in the chapel, line them in 2 neat rows, and have them kneel on the bare floorboards. Their hands were to fold precisely at the midline, thumbs crossing, eyes half closed. The key, he explained in that patient, convincing tone, was the breath. Each was to draw in slowly, hold, and then not let go until vision dimmed at the edges. The aim was not suffering, but making room for God's voice, as he called it. At first the boys coughed, swayed, and fell forward dizzy. Callum did not chastise them. Instead, he helped them back into place, encouraged them to try again, and made careful notes in his ledger. Time held, signs of strain, whether the eyes fluttered open before stillness took hold. The boys thought of it as a game at first, measuring themselves against one another, boasting quietly in the washroom about how long they could last. But the game's edges began to blur. Some emerged from the practice pale and trembling, fingers numb, unable to remember their own names for a moment. Callum called these threshold moments, and those who experienced them were invited to sit closer to the altar the next day. Jacob Fenn reached 1.5 minutes before darkness overtook him. When he came back to himself, he found Callum's face directly above his, lips moving silently as though finishing a sentence only the boy's unconscious mind could hear. The breathing drills grew longer. Callum began timing the sessions with a metronome from his collection, the steady ticking filling the chapel like the heartbeat of some vast and patient thing. The boys were told to match the stillness of the flame in the sealed glass jars as they knelt, no flicker, no wavering. In the cellar, he repeated the same practice alone, metronome ticking, breath held, face turned toward the long wooden table carved with the faint lines of concentric circles. On certain nights, the hollow breathing heard through the vents seemed to grow heavier, layered, as if more than one set of lungs labored in unison down there. The sisters noticed the children's voices thinning, growing hoarse despite the absence of illness. When Sister Marette asked about it, Callum smiled in his calm way and explained that the boys were learning discipline, and discipline always reshaped the body. She nodded, though unease pinched at her temples. At meals, the boys now ate more slowly, as if chewing itself had become another part of the ritual. And when they swallowed, they often sat still afterward, as though listening inward. One afternoon, a farmhand delivering milk passed near the chapel and peered through a warped pane in the side window. Inside, the boys knelt in their lines, unmoving, while Callum walked between them with his hands behind his back. The farmhand swore later that not a single child breathed during the time he watched, yet none of them collapsed. He left quickly, the taste of copper in his mouth, though he could not say why. By the middle of February, the hollow breathing from the cellar had become a constant presence at night. Those sleeping closest to the chapel swore they could feel it moving through the floorboards, not as air but as a faint pressure, pressing down in rhythm with the ticking of the metronome. Outside, the weather stayed warm, the sky pale. The creek did not freeze, but the stones beneath it were coated with a fine, glistening grit that clung stubbornly to the skin, sharp enough to cut if rubbed between fingers. In the quiet hallways of St. Florian's, the boys' footfalls seemed softer, their steps lighter, as though they were being trained for some silent procession none of them fully understood. And always, Callum's voice inside their heads, calm and without hurry, counting the spaces between their breaths, teaching them the value of the moment just before the body must surrender. It was the trapper who found him on a gray dawn when the air smelled of wet stone and old iron. Jacob Fenn lay on the frozen creek bed, though no ice rimmed the water and no snow softened the banks. His knees were bent beneath him, back straight, hands clasped in perfect prayer, head bowed just enough to show submission but not collapse. His skin was smooth and warm to the touch, as though he had just stepped from a bath. Yet there was no breath in him. His eyes were open, fixed on something far beyond the trapper's shoulder. Something that made the man glance behind himself more than once before dragging the boy's small body to shore. The coroner examined him in a room lit by a single oil lamp, his gloved fingers moving with an odd reverence, as though afraid to disturb whatever had left Jacob in such a pose. The boy's lungs, when opened, held no air, no water. Only a fine, crystalline dust, each grain sharp enough to slice through the thin lining of flesh. The particles glinted under the lamplight, catching in the folds of the coroner's mask, and for the briefest moment, he felt as if the boy's chest was still exhaling them into the room. No one could say what the dust was. It did not melt, burn, or dissolve in water. The doctor sealed a sample in a glass vial and locked it away, though in the days that followed he swore he heard it shift inside when the room was quiet. The news traveled through Ashford's Hollow quickly but without noise, as though every mouth that carried it instinctively softened the words. The orphanage was visited that same afternoon. Brother Callum met the constable at the gate, his hands folded and his eyes damp with what looked like grief. He spoke gently of Jacob's absence from morning prayers, of a search that had begun before breakfast, of the fear that some misstep had led the boy to wander too far. He offered no explanation for why Jacob's bed had already been stripped bare, sheets folded, candle burning in its glass jar by the chapel altar. The constable stood before the row of flickering lights, uneasy at how evenly they swayed, as if stirred by the same invisible hand. At the funeral, the town gathered in silence. The coffin was small, unadorned, carried by 4 miners whose faces bore the set expression of men carrying not just a body but the weight of an unfinished story. Callum stood at the head of the grave, one hand resting on the lid as though claiming something only he could see. He spoke briefly of Jacob's early graduation to the kingdom and how the boy had reached a perfect stillness in his faith. The words should have comforted, yet they carried a finality that felt less like mourning and more like satisfaction. The gravedigger, uneasy, noted that the earth where the coffin was lowered was dry and warm to the touch, even in the morning chill. As he shoveled the first layer of soil, he thought he saw a pale sparkle rise from the disturbed dirt and vanish into the air. Later, when asked, he could not explain why he had rubbed his hands together until they bled before leaving the cemetery. In the orphanage, Jacob's absence settled over the boys like an extra blanket, one they could not remove. Meal times were quieter than before, and even the clatter of spoons seemed wrong. At night, when the hollow breathing rose from the cellar vents, some swore they could hear a 17th rhythm in it now, slower and smaller than the rest, keeping pace with the others as though it had always been there. The sisters avoided Callum's eyes more often. Sister Merritt, lying awake in her narrow bed, found herself pressing her own hands together in the dark, her lungs aching from breaths she did not realize she was holding. Outside, the creek water ran clear, untroubled, but those who passed by swore it whispered, its surface catching the pale light like glass dust drifting on a breath. By the week after Jacob's burial, the bread in the orphanage had changed. It was not in taste, not in smell, but in something quieter. The way it left the tongue dry, the way it seemed to draw more from the eater than it gave back. Brother Callum began baking it himself in the early mornings before the boys awoke, the chapel bell not yet rung, the rest of the building still breathing in the slow rhythm of sleep. He worked in silence, sleeves rolled, flour dusting his wrists, the pale square of cloth spread neatly on the table beside him. From a small jar he would pinch a faint grayish powder and work it into the dough, folding it over and over until the mixture was seamless. The jar was never left unattended and its contents never spoken of. The bread was always baked in perfect rounds, each loaf marked on top with a faint ring pressed into the crust by a metal mold. Before slicing, Callum would tap the loaf twice with the side of the knife, a sound dull but deliberate. At first, no one questioned the ritual. Bakers have their habits, and hungry boys do not refuse food. But soon the children began to feel something after eating it. A heaviness behind the eyes, a warmth that spread down the throat, and dreams so vivid they could still taste them on waking. The dreams were always pleasant, yet impossible to recall in detail. The boys would rise with the sense that something had been shown to them, something beautiful, yet just beyond memory's grasp. When Sister Merritt asked one or two of them what they'd dreamed, they would pause, eyes losing focus, then smile faintly and say they couldn't quite remember. She began to notice the powdery smudge at the corners of their mouths after breakfast, a trace of gray that clung stubbornly to the skin. The ash, for that is what it was, came from the small slips of paper the boys had written in their nightly confessions. Callum burned them in the cellar's brazier, tending the flames as one might tend a holy relic. When the fire left only pale residue, he sifted it carefully, discarding nothing, storing every grain in the jar. He called it, in the privacy of his thoughts, the circle of purity, a way of returning a boy's sins to his body purified, so that he might one day leave the world without stain. In the chapel, the candles in their glass jars burned with an unnatural steadiness, and some began to believe the bread had something to do with it. When a boy was missing from morning roll, his candle appeared the same day, flame already lit, glass sealed tight. Callum never explained the connection, but the pattern became undeniable. Those who had eaten most heartily from the bread would sometimes fall ill, not with fever or coughing, but with a stillness that grew inside them. They would speak less, move more slowly, and kneel longer in the prayer posture without complaint. Outside the orphanage, the townsfolk remarked that the boys looked paler, yet strangely peaceful. Some called it piety, others whispered of wasting sickness, but none dared confront Callum, whose calm voice and careful gaze made questions falter in the throat. In the market, he bought flour in smaller, more frequent amounts, as though to avoid notice, yet the baker's wife swore he left with loaves heavier than the ones she had given him. One evening, when the wind shifted, a faint, burnt paper scent drifted from the chapel door during vespers. Those who caught it said it was gone as soon as they tried to focus on it, like a word half heard in a dream. That night, the hollow breathing from the cellar took on a faint crackle, as though the dust itself were alive down there, sifting and settling in some unseen chamber. The boys no longer asked where the missing had gone. They simply ate the bread when it was given, folded their hands when told, and dreamed dreams they could not name. And in the cellar, the jar of ash grew lighter by the day, yet the pile of slips waiting to be burned never seemed to shrink. By late February, the candles breathed when the boys did not, thin flames keeping a faultless tempo. Brother Callum announced a goal like a blessing. One unbroken day of prayer, posture held from dawn to dusk. Training lengthened by careful degrees measured by the metronome and a chalk mark that crept along the chapel wall. He called it a vigil of stillness, a shape the soul could wear when it wished to be seen. Pairs were assigned so no one fell unseen. One watched the rise between shoulder blades, then they traded without a word. Breath became thread, drawn thin, withheld until sparks crowded vision and the ear filled with soft water. Those who wavered were steadied by his touch at crown or sternum, obedience returning like memory sliding back into place. Night after night the cellar exhaled hollow respiration, the floors settling as though the building listened and approved. Dreams changed. Boys woke tasting sweet dust, remembering kneeling inside a room with no corners and a patient ring of time. The sky stayed pale and lidless. The creek slid without ice. February advanced like a sentence refusing to end. Without saying it, Callum chose the day and wrote in his ledger, "One day, perfect without a tremor." Before sunrise, he woke them with a soft bell that felt already inside the head, not striking but remembering. Windows were cracked for pale air, white tunics laid out, the metronome set to a human pace, almost kind. He arranged 2 arcs before the altar, hands folded, knees squared, eyes lowered until the world narrowed to flame and breath. Minutes became measures. Measures turned to calm pools. Pools stretched into a level road with no markers. He walked with a mirror, catching each face to watch pupils darken and steady, noting panic's rise and surrender. When a child swayed, he warmed the collarbone with his breath, persuading the body that air still existed and could wait. Outside, miners paused mid-swing without reason. A heron practiced the same lesson on the bank without knowing its name. At the 5th hour, Thad's arms trembled. The metronome slowed a fraction. The tremor seemed embarrassed and left. At the 7th, another boy blued. A touch of warm bread tricked the brain back to the posture with grateful eyes. The candles in glass did not flicker. The sealed wicks looked longer, as though flame fed on something finer than air. The ledger grew spare. Hour 9, none collapsed. Hour 10, corrected by touch. Hour 11, thresholds passed. Hour 12, all present. Fainting looked rehearsed. Lowered, jaw eased, chest pressed once. A whisper at the ear, and rising at 3 as required. The body learned to bury the swallow inside stillness so the prayer would look unbroken from any angle. By late afternoon, the room smelled of lemon oil, warm cloth, and a mineral edge like stone ground fine. The glass jars seemed to watch, each flame a witness with perfect posture, receiving a promise not yet spoken. Hour 13 arrived as the sun leaned toward the ravine and the tempo threaded the nerves of every listener. He set the mirror aside and moved without the ledger, measuring small chests with both palms, finding an ease that chilled him with joy. He whispered that God's voice was near. The words landed like dust everywhere, weightless and sure of themselves. The last stretch required surrender that looked like trust and felt like erasure. The boys accepted it without flinching. Hour 14 came like a held breath, beginning to believe it might never release. Pressure settled on shoulders and teeth. Thad's eyes widened. Another boy's fingers curled until a pinch and permission made them straighten like obedient wire. Sister Merritt stepped forward and then back, unable to decide which counted as courage in a room so polite. The sun touched the ridge. The chapel felt like a clock, and the town the small hand moving around it. Then, as if the room chose, every chest paused together. Not violent but decided, held beyond any rehearsed measure. It lasted a beat, then 2, then 3. Silence thickened until it felt poured into the bones of the benches. Callum lifted his hands in benediction, eyes bright with the arrival of a vision rehearsed for years, and finally seated. When breath returned, it came thin and shy. No boy dared look at another for fear of cracking the surface. Evening folded over Ashford's Hollow without flake or gust. Doors did not need testing. Hinges kept their manners. The vigil ended by nod, not bell. Posture unlocked. Feet found the aisle. Order held like a wire pulled straight. They filed past the candles, whose flames leaned together for a heartbeat, greeting the new stillness they recognized. The night held its breath and listened. By the first week of March, 17 glass jars stood on the altar, each with a tall white candle burning inside. They were spaced with exacting symmetry, their flames swaying in unison, as if moved by a breath that came from nowhere in the chapel. Brother Callum began preparing the remaining boys for what he called the final alignment. It was not explained, only implied in glances toward the jars and in the ledger, where dates were written in a column without names beside them. That night, after the town's lamps had gone dark, he dressed the boys in identical white tunics cinched at the waist with thin braided cords. He led them barefoot into the chapel where the floorboards had been scrubbed until they shone pale in the candlelight. Outside, the ridge wind had stilled completely, leaving the night air heavy, expectant. From beyond the walls came the faint sound of running water, though the creek was too far to hear in any ordinary hour. Callum positioned the boys in two perfect rows facing the altar. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man setting pieces on a board for a game where no one survives unless they stay exactly where placed. He instructed them to kneel, hands folded, heads slightly bowed, not too far, not too little. He walked among them with the metronome in his palm, ticking softly, aligning their breath to its beat. There was no prayer in words, only the rhythm. Inhale, hold longer, exhale in a controlled ribbon of air. After an hour, the air in the chapel had shifted. It was warmer, heavier, and carried a faint mineral tang that scraped lightly at the back of the throat. The candle flames in the glass jars began leaning toward the boys as if drawn to their breath. Callum's eyes reflected each flame in turn, scanning for any falter in posture or rhythm. When one boy's shoulders sagged, Callum placed a hand on the back of his neck until the spine straightened again. As the hours passed, the air grew almost thick enough to touch. Sister Merritt stood near the door, her hands hidden in her sleeves, unsure if she was witnessing devotion or something more final. Outside, the night sky was unnaturally clear. Stars shone sharp and fixed. No wind dared disturb them. The chapel seemed sealed away from time. Near dawn, the change came. It was not marked by a sound, but by the absence of all movement. Every boy's chest had stilled, their heads lowered in perfect submission, their skin taking on the faint translucence of marble. Their eyes remained open, not staring blankly but fixed, as if they saw something beyond the altar that no one else could see. The candles in the jars swayed once, then all stood perfectly upright, their flames frozen mid-dance. When Callum stepped back, his expression was neither grief nor triumph. It was recognition. He had rehearsed this moment in the secrecy of his own mind for years, and now it stood before him as precise as the lines in his ledger. He knelt among them, placing one hand on the floor and closed his eyes. For a full minute, the chapel was as silent as the space between heartbeats. Then he rose, walked to the altar, and placed the 17th jar in its exact place among the others. The flame inside burned taller than the rest, a pale gold that seemed to give off no heat. He sealed the lid, and for a moment the glass clouded faintly as if something inside had sighed. The rows of boys remained exactly as they were, kneeling, hands clasped, eyes open, bodies warm yet utterly still. When the morning sun finally reached the chapel windows, it lit their faces but could not make their eyes blink. Callum opened the door to the outside air, and a thin stream of white dust drifted from the threshold, catching the light before vanishing. He stood in the doorway for a long while, as though waiting to see if the wind would answer him. It did not. The town awoke to the sound of the chapel bell ringing once, low and deliberate, and though no one was summoned, everyone heard it. Inside, 17 boys knelt in prayer that would never end. By mid-morning, the chapel door was wedged open with a hymnal, warm air spilling out, the 17 glass jars gleaming as if polished by breath. The constable, the doctor, and a stern deacon halted at the sight of boys in perfect kneel, skin warm, eyes steady, hands joined like a lock. Brother Callum was gone. His ledger lay open on the front pew, columns neat, dates aligned, names replaced by private marks. The doctor pressed a brow and flinched at the heat. No pulse answered. The chest would not fall. The deacon murmured that peace had visited the house, The constable stared at the sealed candles and said peace did not usually travel in glass. A drift of pale dust crossed the aisle like sifted flour and led behind the altar tapestry to the iron door at the end of the hall. The lock turned. The cellar exhaled its hollow rhythm. Lanterns went first. Light found a table cut with concentric rings, each groove filled with the same crystalline powder taken from Jacob's lungs. A metronome sat stopped at a chosen notch. A brass mirror lay face down. Thin-lipped glass cylinders waited in a row, dry and clean. The doctor brushed a groove. Dust clung to his sleeve. He shook it into a vial and watched the grains hang too long as if listening. Against the far wall, a brazier held a bed of pale residue sifted flat. A second table held stacks of confession slips. The handwriting tightened until it broke into loops that circled a blank center. Many had been burned. Callum's careful hands were everywhere, though the man was not. The ledger's last page spoke in numbers. Durations, intervals, the word perfect written once. The constable traced the rings, each a breath made into geometry. Faint finger marks pressed the rim where a child had steadied himself. The deacon named it a heresy of order. The doctor gave it no name. He only listened. The breathing seemed to come from the grooves, a borrowed sound repeating the lesson it had been fed. They carried boys to the infirmary and came back for more. Each time a body crossed the chapel door, a film of white rose from the boards and followed like visible breath, then vanished in the yard as if the outside would not receive it. Word moved through Ashford's Hollow the way fear moves once it learns manners. Miners stood at the fence, palms on chests, feeling their lungs answer the cadence leaking from the door. By evening, the constable closed the cellar and set a man there, though the breathing went on through the keyhole. A letter for the circuit judge was written tight. Behind the tapestry, the dust table waited. After dark, the doctor returned with scales and paper. Each pinch weighed the same, as if the pile had been taught to hold one lesson at a time. He pinched again. The lantern guttered. The metronome lifted and fell a hair, then stilled. He wrote that the powder resisted heat, water, and pity. The deacon sealed cylinders and prayed through his teeth. Upstairs, Sister Merritt scrubbed small hands, though no dirt came away, whispering that warmth does not prove life and stillness does not prove virtue. On the altar, the jar flames leaned and straightened. Near midnight, the guard dozed and woke to a new circle drawn in the dust, neat as a coin, unmarked by any footfall. He rubbed it away. It returned, finer, closing itself without sound. The guard swallowed and faced the door. In the morning, the judge would come, the door would open again, and the town would learn the word ritual in a way that stays with the hand and the tongue. Until then, the cellar practiced its breath. The dust waited for instructions, and the stopped metronome held the second where choice pretended to be grace. The judge arrived with a surveyor, a priest from the next county, and a folded letter authorizing custody of the building until facts made sense, though facts had not cooperated for months. He listened to the doctor speak of dust that would not behave and boys whose bodies stayed warm without breath, then walked the yard and looked up at the colorless sky that had refused to snow. Old miners approached with caps in hand, saying the year had turned out wrong from the first week, the air thin as sifted flour, lamps needing less trimming as if something else kept them steady. In the courthouse, the weatherman's ledger showed a season of false thaws without freezes, cloud lines that formed and then paused at the ridge like a herd that would not cross. Town memory thickened around a theory no one had words for until the priest, cautious, said, "Perhaps a bargain had been made, not with fire or devil, but with emptiness itself. The town's winter traded away to teach children how to hold their breath until the sky learned the same habit." The idea sounded foolish, and yet it fit, the way a lid fits a jar when the thread is new. The judge ordered witnesses to speak in plain lines, stripped of fear and show. A delivery man described a night vent breathing back at him in a rhythm that matched his own heart until he had to lean away. A farmhand remembered boys who did not seem to need air when they knelt, their chests quiet for far too long while the metronome ticked as calm as sleep. Sister Merit lifted her hands and showed the gray that would not wash from under her nails, saying the house had taught her to breathe smaller, and she did not remember when she had learned. The weatherman admitted the strangest part. The one day the sky darkened like snow, it passed over without a single flake, then brightened at the very hour the chapel bell rang once, and then went still. The priest walked the creek and found stones rimmed with a shining grit that cut if rubbed, and he dared say aloud that perhaps the town had been breathing the children's practice without knowing, filling lungs with a lesson meant for kneeling bodies, not for fields and houses. The judge, a practical man, wrote that a ritual can change behavior, and behavior can change weather, and if that sounded mad, he would let time shame him. He ordered the orphanage closed, the cellar sealed under his seal, the jars removed to the courthouse vault until experts from Denver could answer simple questions. But the jars did not like travel. The first wagon shuddered and the horse balked, foam on its bit, when the 17th flame leaned and held, glass humming faint like a sung note. The driver removed the jar and the horse settled, and that was that, the candles staying where they were until someone braver came. In town, the talk shifted from grief to patterns, mothers saying their babies slept too deep, men waking at night with lungs tight and teeth clenched, each dream ending in a chapel that had no corners. The missing winter became a thing they could point to, a shape that proved the story, and every pale morning was an exhibit. The judge wrote again to Denver and to the territorial governor, asking for a law that watched locked doors and measured the hands that claimed children as their work. He stood at the fence at dusk and felt the evening hold its breath for a second too long, like a sentence waiting on a last word that would not come. And he understood then that whatever had been taught inside St. Florian's had not stayed there. It had touched the sky, and the sky had learned to wait. When men finally counted the rooms and matched them to ledgers, Brother Callum had left no coat, no spare boots, and no hair in his comb. His satchel was gone. The pale cloth from his table had been folded once, then again, and set on the shelf as if waiting for the next set of hands. The constable sent riders along the coach road and through the mining camps. They found a bunk used for a single night and a crust of bread tapped twice on its crust and left uneaten. A boy in a freight yard said a soft man with careful eyes had boarded a wagon heading south before dawn, paying with a clean coin and a word that made the driver feel ashamed for asking more. Weeks later, a prospector stumbled into a mission ruin near the New Mexico line. a squat adobe with its roof fallen in, and a crucifix nailed to a beam that no longer knew its purpose. He told the sheriff he saw a man kneeling before a row of glass jars set like an altar on a cracked stone. 17 in all, flames alive though no wind moved them, each leaning toward the kneeling back as if drawn by a single slow breath. The prospector watched until his teeth ached with the stillness and left without speaking, walking backwards for the first dozen steps as if turning his back would invite something to follow. He laughed at himself on the trail and spat to clear the taste of dust he swore he had not breathed. 3 days later, he was found on the floor of his shack, knees bent, hands folded, skin warm, lungs filled with the same bright grit the doctor's vials could not tame. The sheriff rode to the ruin and found only scorch marks shaped like rings on stone, a metronome's groove in soft dust where a weight had sat and ticked, and prints that began and ended with the patience of a clerk. A telegraph rattled north with news shaped like rumor, and Ashford's Hollow met the message with a silence that felt like relief to some and like failure to others. The judge wrote that a body had not been caught, but a method had been taught, and methods travel farther than men. Writers kept writing anyway, following small clues that turned to manners as they crossed county lines. Bread tapped twice on a windowsill, hymn notes held a beat longer than the throat should want. A circle traced in ash on the lip of a water barrel. Each sign might have been nothing, yet each made someone breathe carefully until the feeling passed. Sister Marette folded the boy's clothes for the last time and locked the chapel with a key that felt warm, then handed it to the judge and asked him to keep it where dust could not learn the shape. In the town, men avoided the word hunt when they spoke of Callum. They said watch instead, as if the man were already everywhere a person might kneel. The telegraph eventually went quiet, not because the story ended, but because it learned to wait between places like breath held in a chest that did not yet know if it would be allowed to return. Years turned and left their marks in quiet ways, a fence rebuilt without measuring, a porch board worn smooth by a widow's careful step, a field that grew better when not watched. St. Florian stood empty behind the judge's seal until a spring lightning strike split the bell and set the rafters smoldering. The townspeople pulled water until the walls sighed inward and the place lay like a map of its own rooms. After that, the county voted to let the ground go fallow, a square of earth no one would plow or claim, and a memorial went up at the edge where children would have to look up to see it. 17 iron stakes stood in a row, each topped with a small metal flame, plain and stubborn, the kind that does not ask to be beautiful. On clear mornings, a dusting of pale ash appeared only on those tips, no matter how the wind blew, and mothers wiped them with rags that never came clean again. The judge's letters turned into law when Denver finally listened. The Territorial Act for the Protection of Wards required that orphan houses register their ledgers monthly, that all cellars and side rooms be catalogued and unlocked for inspectors without notice, that sacramental rites never involve fasting or breath restraint, that confession slips could not be destroyed without a second signature. Doors that hid quiet practices were to be removed or their keys held by 2 unrelated caretakers, one appointed by the court. A clause written in the judge's hand forbade sealed flames anywhere children slept. Churches grumbled, some out of habit, some out of suspicion that oversight proved distrust. But the law held and spread, renamed when statehood came, its language copied to other counties after other quiet places were found to have their own versions of stillness. A traveling nurse taught town mothers to watch for gray collars that would not wash, and for children who preferred a long-held breath to a laugh. Her advice sounded strange until it saved a girl in a neighboring valley from a sleep cure that would have trained her lungs into a lesson she did not need. The county school began a morning roll that included a simple rule spoken aloud by every child. Breathing is not sin. Air is not a test. In the courthouse vault, the jars stayed for a time under blankets, then were moved to a stone room under the judge's desk, each flame finally pinched and wicks cut to stubs by a chemist whose hands shook. Even cold, the glass felt faintly alive to anyone who touched it. The chemist recorded that the dust inside did not change when sealed away from light, did not clump, did not forget its edges. He retired early and left town without saying why. As for the land, grass returned, then wildflowers, and then a low fence around the stakes where children tied white ribbons when they passed. On certain winters, the sky above the memorial went pale as milk while the next field kept its blue, and the old people nodded without liking it. They said the place was learning to be harmless the way a wound learns to be a scar. But a scar is still a story your skin remembers. The law hardened, inspectors came, and a starved kind of piety went out of fashion. Yet on quiet Sundays, the creek still sounded like a breath held and released, and no one pretended they did not hear it. The legacy was ink, iron, and habit changed by a story that refused to end where a graveyard begins. From a distance, the story looked simple. A gentle man with careful hands taught children to disappear by degrees until their bodies obeyed a command no body should hear. But a closer look shows how it worked in ordinary light, inside trust, where evil moved like a school teacher, tidying desks, trimming pencils to one length, calling obedience a kindness. It wore patience and waited while good people ignored the feeling that something soft could also be sharp. It asked for smaller things first, a slip of paper folded and given up, a breath held a few seconds longer than felt right, a loaf tapped twice before slicing, and those small things trained the hands and lungs until larger things felt natural. That is how silence becomes a shape that fits a town. The boys learned to treat air like a test, and the town learned with them, trading winter for a lesson it did not understand. Callum did not shout or strike. He rearranged meaning, turning stillness into virtue and surrender into proof, and because he believed it, others did too. The candles behind glass looked holy because glass promises order, and order can be a safety when fear is near. Yet order without mercy feeds on children. A place can forget to argue, and when it does, a man like Callum is already there, measuring breath with a metronome and calling it prayer. The law that followed matters. Iron stakes matter, inspections matter. They are ways of teaching the next set of hands to doubt a locked door and to ask who holds the key. But laws come after harm. The earlier guard is a small voice that says no in rooms where saying no feels rude. Evil that hides in care depends on our good manners to survive. It wants us to look away from a boy swaying and call it devotion rather than a warning. It wants us to accept a season without snow because the sky looks tidy. The lesson from Ashford's Hollow is not that monsters lurk in every chapel. It is that methods can turn people into tools if no one interrupts. A town must practice interruption the way those boys practice stillness, until the habit holds when it is needed. The ground where St. Florian stood will always breathe differently. Some scars give off weather. When the winter sky goes pale now, people stop and breathe on purpose, slow and full. A quiet refusal passed down in families who never met those boys. At the memorial, children ask why there are only iron flames and not names, and parents answer that sometimes we do not get the names back, but we keep the lesson and carry it forward. The story sits with them then, not like a ghost, but like a hand on the shoulder reminding them to inhale without fear. And you, listening now, can decide whether this kind of quiet can grow again behind a locked door you pass each day. What do you think? Could this happen again if kindness is confused with control? If we trade our breath for approval, if we let the calmest voice in the room define what a perfect child looks like?